There is a moment in every civilization when the state fails its people. When the law cannot reach or simply chooses not to, something else fills that void. In Japan, it was known by a single word. They did not begin as monsters. They began as men the world had already cast aside. The world has elevated them into something mythic: honor, brotherhood, a warrior's code reborn in the underworld. That myth is a product, carefully maintained, strategically useful. Behind it, extortion, coercion, a hierarchy built on the willingness to inflict pain. The tattoos are real, the loyalty is real. But loyalty in this world runs upward, never down. And the men who entered this world rarely understood what they were truly joining, until the door closed behind them. To understand the Yakuza, you must first understand what Japan was. The Tokugawa shogunate, which consolidated power in 1603, built one of the most controlled societies in human history. Borders sealed. Foreign trade restricted to a single port. Social class immovable. You were born a farmer, you would die a farmer. Your children would be farmers. The system was not cruel by intention. It was simply indifferent to individuals, and that is its own form of violence. And then there were those the system had no category for at all. The burakumin occupied the lowest rung of a caste. The official hierarchy refused to even acknowledge. Handlers of the dead, leather workers or executioners. Necessary labor performed by people declared spiritually unclean for performing it. They lived separately, married separately, worshipped separately. Generations sealed inside a stigma that predated the people currently enforcing it. Then there were the ronin, samurai without masters. Men trained for war, given an identity built entirely around service, and then left without anyone to serve. By some estimates, there were nearly 500,000 ronin drifting through Japan at the height of the Edo period. Men who knew how to use a sword and had no legitimate way to do so. A society shapes its criminals with the same precision it shapes its institutions. The Bakuto were gamblers, not casual men who played for pleasure. Professional gamblers who ran the games, controlled the dens, and took their cut from every hand dealt. They operated in the spaces the law ignored: rural outskirts, construction camps, or the edges of castle towns, wherever men had wages and nothing to do but spend them. The promise of work, roads, castles, new land, attracted countless laborers. Men far from home, men with money and time, but no ties to the community around them. The Bakuto understood something elemental. Boredom is a market. Loneliness is a market. The desire to feel something, anything, is a market, and they were there to service it. The word Yakuza itself comes from the Bakuto, a losing hand in the card game Oichokabu, 8-9-3. Yakuza, a hand that meant nothing, a hand with no future. They named themselves after failure, perhaps because they had nothing left to lose by admitting it. Or maybe they refused the hand given to them and set out to deal a new one. The tekiya were peddlers, traveling merchants who sold goods, sometimes legitimate, often counterfeit, at temple fairs and street markets across the country. They mastered the art of selling, of spectacle, of the precise performance that earns trust before it's deserved. Fake medicines, diluted goods, counterfeit crafts, sold at genuine prices. The tekiya existed at the intersection of commerce and theater, and they were very good at both. But survival in this trade required more than salesmanship. It required territory. The tekiya began organizing market territories, determining who could operate where. The closer to the gates, the higher the cost. Prime ground for those willing to buy it. They called it membership. They called it protection. The semantics shifted depending on the audience. The result was the same, regardless of the word used. The Tokugawa shogunate presented a paradox. It was obsessed with control, social, political, economic, yet it could not govern everything. and it knew it. Governing the surface of that city was difficult enough. Governing what moved underneath it was another matter entirely. The shogunate needed labor controlled, markets kept in line, and order enforced in places its officials rarely ventured. It needed men who could manage the unmanageable. In many documented cases, takiya bosses were formally licensed by local authorities. They were granted the right to carry a surname, a privilege of the samurai class. Some were permitted to carry swords. Men who stood outside every recognized social category were handed the symbols of the highest one. The state did not create the Yakuza, but the state, when it was convenient, not only looked away, it also handed them a sword and asked them to use it. That arrangement would prove very difficult to undo. What separated these groups from common criminals was the same thing that separated a feudal army from a mob: hierarchy. The oyabun-kobun system. Oyabun, the father role; kobun, the child role. A bond forged not by blood, but by duty, modeled on the Confucian order that defined society. The ritual was precise. Sake, the same drink exchanged at weddings, at shrine ceremonies, at every formal marking of a life-altering bond, was shared between boss and subordinate. After that cup, the kobun owed the oyabun complete loyalty, total obedience, the willingness, if required, to absorb punishment on his behalf, to go to prison for decisions he did not make, to die for a man he called father. In return, he was given protection, income, and belonging. For men who had been cast out of every legitimate structure Japan offered, this was not a small thing. It was, for many of them, the first time in their lives they had a family. The irezumi, the full-body tattoo, served several functions simultaneously. It was more than identity. It was belonging to a world that accepted you when another would not. It was also practical. You could not remove it. You could not go back. And anyone paying attention could see it. He had already decided there was no turning back. The code they operated under was not written down. It did not need to be. Like all enduring rules, it was enforced by example, by what happened to those who crossed it. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, these groups extended their reach methodically. Labor contracting, market allocation, gambling, and underneath all of it, protection. Protection is a simple business model. You pay, and nothing happens to you. You don't, and something does. What made it elegant and endurable was that the threat rarely needed to be made explicit. The reputation preceded every conversation. The genius of the model was that the Yakuza were often protecting merchants from themselves, from the Yakuza. They manufactured the threat and sold the solution. And the men who understood this said nothing, because understanding did not make them any safer. Gradually, the payments became standard, budgeted and normalized. The Meiji Restoration shattered the world that had produced the Yakuza and accelerated their evolution. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of former samurai became civilians with combat training, military discipline, and no institutional home. The gambling dens absorbed them. The protection networks gave them ranks commensurate with their experience. Men who had spent their lives inside rigid hierarchies found the oyabun-kobun structure immediately legible. The Meiji government also unleashed urbanization on an unprecedented scale. Factories, ports, construction projects reshaping the coastlines of major cities. Tens of thousands of displaced rural workers pouring into cities with no support networks. The Yakuza were there to receive and organize them, to put them to work and collect a cut of everything they made. Every fracture in the system produced the same result: new men with nothing and new places to fill. The relationship between the Yakuza and Japanese authority was never simple opposition. It was something more useful and more dangerous than that. Labor unions were emerging across Japan's new industrial cities. Workers organizing, demanding wages, threatening to stop the machinery of an economy that powerful men had built. The Yakuza were deployed to break them. Political campaigns used Yakuza to intimidate opposition voters. They resolved problems meant to stay hidden, cases that would collapse under legal attention. The arrangement required deniability, and deniability required distance. And that distance, that careful, maintained gap, protected both sides. The state's hands stayed clean, the work got done, and the Yakuza accumulated, with each transaction, another piece of leverage over the men who had used them. Strip away the ceremony, the ritual cups, the elaborate tattoos and the borrowed samurai loyalty and duty. At the foundation of all of it was coercion. The Yakuza did not ask, they informed. The merchants who paid protection were not partners, they were resources. The gamblers who came to the dens were not guests, they were inventory. They would spend their wages, borrow against their future wages, and then spend those too. A man in debt is a man controlled, and controlled was always the point. Yubitsume, the severing of the finger joint. The practice likely evolved from gambling culture. A card handler who had lost their boss's money, losing the finger that dealt the cards. Over time, it became ritualized penance. A subordinate who had failed, embarrassed, or dishonored his superior could offer the finger as apology, as proof that the lesson had been absorbed. The boss received it, considered, and perhaps accepted the apology, or perhaps not. Multiple offenses meant multiple joints. Men who had been in the organization long enough and who had failed enough were missing several. The history of their errors written on their hands. The histories of organized crime tend to track the men who ran it, the violence that established it, the power that accumulated at the top. What is harder to document is who paid for all of it. The protection payments came out of margins that were already thin, out of households where every coin had been counted, out of communities abandoned by authority. No police, no courts, and no power to rely on. They were not in the story. They were the ground the story was built on. Watch it long enough, and the illusion begins to break. The outcast built with remarkable precision a replica of the system that had cast them out. Strict hierarchy, total loyalty demanded from below, obligations flowing upward. The strong taking what they want and labeling it order. They had not escaped the system. They had internalized it so completely. They rebuilt it from memory, in the dark, with whatever materials were available. There is a version of this story where the Yakuza are rebels, men who fell outside the system and built something of their own, where brotherhood replaced isolation and loyalty filled the void. That version is not false, it is simply incomplete. The Yakuza did not rise despite Japan's social order. They rose because of it. They rose through every gap the state left open, every broken promise, every man it cast aside. Every society that decides certain men are worthless creates men who have decided the same thing about everyone else. The dice were loaded from the beginning. The Bakuto knew it. The Tekia knew it. The Ronin who drifted into their dens and their territories, carrying swords and no purpose, they knew it too. They simply decided if the game was fixed, they would stop playing by the rules they were given and start writing their own.